Hello, everyone, and welcome to this second installment of our conversation about multitude. And the book, of course, the homework for this week takes us into the second part of the book, the sort of 2.0, 2.1, 2.2 sort of series of chapters. I think this is a sort of a fascinating part of the book because this is where they really wanted to get at the beginning. This is what they wanted the book to be about, yet they had to do this sort of, as we were talking about last week, this sort of sidestep into the nature of war and some of the issues that are going on with biopolitical securitization. And many people, I think, in my own view, who have looked at the book have sort of focused on that aspect of it. Certainly it's worth thinking about and focusing on, but it's not, I don't think, what the book was supposed to be about, and it was supposed to be a sort of a detour. So let's just talk about, in a way, this effort that starts in the second part, which we're reading this week, to drill down and focus on what the multitude is meant to function as within their theorization of empire. I think it was the great complaint that people had about their first book, that this concept of the multitude wasn't really specified. And so what we're working towards, and I obviously don't have time to go through the entire section that we're assigned to read, but I have taken some notes and tried to put together some thoughts about the chapters that we would approach and meet first, although those aren't obviously the chapters that you have to read, but I'm going to focus in on 2.0, 2.1. And I think those are good places to start because in a way those are the primer chapters, right? Those are the chapters that give us the initial sort of philosophy, the initial conceptual development that Hart and Negri are trying to get towards. And the first point that they make really is, what is this multitude? And it's a fascinating point that they're trying to get towards, I think, the idea of a difference that remains different, as you see on page 99. And the problem, I guess, with other sort of potential definitions or terms that they would want to use to sort of talk about who this subject is that they're hoping will take up the baton of fighting for democracy on the planet today in an age of permanent war, in an age of rapacious capitalism, and in an age where it seems like our very life force is being stolen from us through capitalist expropriation. They want to sort of ask this question, what word should we look for? Should we look for the people? Well, the people seem to be a very unified bunch of actors, and they seem to stand as one. There's no sort of space in the people for difference. They're very homogenous. Similarly, the crowd seems like a very passive phenomena. It's aimless, it's listless, it doesn't have a purpose. The people has purpose, but the crowd doesn't have purpose. And so perhaps that's a completely flawed concept for us. The masses similarly are very reactive. The masses can be cajoled and browbeaten and persuaded ideologically in different ways. So none of those terms really seem to do, but the multitude has a potential use here as a term where a multitude doesn't necessarily pose a group of people that are all exactly the same. Instead, they are all different, but they have maybe something in common. And so in order to explore that question of what the multitude has in common, Hart and Negri ask about the utility of thinking about the multitude as a kind of a class that is different within itself, but has something in common in terms of the fact that while we all have this difference, some of us are struggling for different rights. And of course, I've explained to you before in the last class, like that a lot of this thinking comes out of the late 60s and early 70s, when struggles for social justice were starting to take shape in and outside of the paradigm that had been set for social struggle by the Marxist sort of dominant sort of party communism approach to thinking about social revolt and social justice. And so everyone was seen as either a worker or not a worker, right? And it was a very narrow way of looking at struggle and a very narrow way of looking at what the goals were of social justice movements. But with the breakdown of loyalty to the Communist Party in the 60s and 70s in Europe, the emergence of new standpoints in feminism, in those who are seeking for racial justice, those who are seeking for facilities and rights for, maybe the disabled, are those, very interestingly, looking for rights and for those who are sort of subjugated as sort of colonial struggles. I think there were all these sort of there's a new need for categories, and what the multitude as a concept for Hart and Negri allows them to do is it allows them to accept that power is a multivalent phenomena. Different types of power can dominate different types of people differently. But while that's true, all of these struggles are nevertheless taking place against a common background, the common background of global capitalism. Because of the globalization of global capitalism, not just any old capitalism, but biopolitical capitalism, we are uniquely sort of challenged by the fact that we are operating within and against this capitalism, right? We are unable to find an exterior to it at this stage. It has sort of colonized the entire planet. And so the question is to, instead of sort of looking at specific instances and singularities of struggle in terms of how people find themselves confronted by this or that type of power, those comparative sort of assessments will have to take place now against the backdrop of capitalism as a sort of a general experience. And so when we look at different types of resistance, we have to figure out how those resistances have this one thing in common. Maybe they have other things in common too, of course, but certainly they have this, while they may appear very, very different in their goals and experiences and histories, and they are, because of globalization, they have this in common. So that's kind of the background concept of the multitude. That's the background theorization of the multitude. I guess the thing we take away from it is Hart and Negri are willing to anticipate or accept that power that confronts different groups of people is multivalent. It has different types of things that it's composed of. Some is racial, some is gendered, some is plain old sort of a capitalist. But nevertheless, all of these struggles now have this shared background. So when we want to look then at 2.1, we talk about who are the dangerous classes, and having said what they've said about class, the first question we would ask is their definition of class reductive? Well, there's a good reason for asking that question, because if ever you read Marx, or people who talk about Marxism especially, there's a tendency to say that Marx is a reductive thinker about social relations. And in his reductiveness, that he tends to sort of see history as an automatic process, a dialectic process, if you will, that's resolving itself through material clashes or struggles throughout history, ever more towards a realization of the domination of the proletariat, and that the proletariat are the ultimate sort of victors in history. Hart and Negri really, really, really dispute that understanding of Marx, this strictly dialectical reading of Marx. They don't want to focus in on this sort of cliched version of Marx. They believe that in Marx, if you read him properly, if you read Capital, if you read the notebooks of Marx, which are known as the Grundrisse, and we'll get to those later, that the key point is that that class is a political phenomena, right? And that means it comes out of certain types of conditions, and it has to bring itself. Classes don't just exist, they also have to bring themselves into existence. And so if you want to understand what the class is, or what the potential multitude is, the potential for a multitude today, you have to start with the existing conditions and look at the collective resistances to power that are going on in those conditions. You can't just sort of theorize it. You have to look at the concrete responses that are ongoing to domination and to power in the world, and let the authentic sort of concrete instances speak for themselves to see what they're summoning into existence. So what Hart and Negri are trying to do, I guess, is offer language to describe things that they see actually going on in the world. It's not like that this is just something they're making up. these are real concrete things, and if you want to change the terminology or change the words, that's fine. But they're not going to necessarily have too much of a problem with you disputing specific terms, but they're going to have much more of a problem with you disputing the concrete examples and empirical evidence that they are basing their work on. I think that's very important to say. Another thing about it, though, that's just to keep in mind is that class isn't just about what's going on in the concrete. It's also a future-oriented concept, and this is very important for Hart and Negri, that they're looking at the lines of collective resistance to power, but they're looking at them in a way that tries to anticipate what these resistances might be leading towards. And so the classic sort of Marxist idea here, and they have this line on page 106 that I like: from the struggle against nature toward the surplus and abundance of human productivity. And that's kind of the goal of Marxism, isn't it? It's the idea that, mankind will triumph against his own nature, the nature of the world around him, and the injustices of the society that he lives in, and arrive at some point at a time and a place where there's enough to live on, and there's enough to be comfortable with, and there's even some luxuries. And we have tapped and made possible through our politics a situation wherein every single human being is being as productive as they can reasonably be expected to be and still have a dignified existence. But everyone's making a contribution in the best way that they can do so, right? From each according to their, as this is, I'm sure you've heard this before, but if you haven't, there's a classic old Marxist line, from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. And I think that's what's really going on here, is the idea of an abundant society whereby everyone's working about as hard as they can given their abilities, while still having a dignified and upright lifestyle that has a measure of luxury, that has a measure of time for personal development, that has a measure of time for the things that fulfill us and make us who we are. So that's an ideal. It's a society that we may never fully be able to realize, but it's the ideal that we should be working towards, for Marxists anyway, and for Hart and Negri too. I mean, this is a part of Marx that they really believe in. It's a part of Marx they believe in. I tell you, one of the things that sort of amazes me, just sort of anecdotally in my own personal experience, is the amount of people who think that being a Marxist is somehow to do with giving up worldly goods and possessions, that Marxism is a kind of an austerity, or a philosophy of austerity, that it's about that in a way it sort of parallels or echoes what we learn from Christ's teachings, that the rich man has less chance getting into heaven than he has of getting through the camel through the eye of a needle. I don't think Marxism is really Christian in that sense. I don't think Marx agrees with Christ. I don't think it's about poverty or the gloriousness of having nothing. The idea and of course this is maybe confusing, because later on they're going to talk about the virtues of poverty, but they're not going to talk about the virtues of poverty in the way that Jesus Christ meant them. I think that Marx clearly had an ideal of a society of abundance, and it's funny today that a lot of people on the left today that are not Marxist, sort of maybe more mainstream socialist types or progressive types, tend to come to this question from the perspective of religion, and so they take a very cynical standpoint about material goods and services that seem to be kind of in any way luxurious or superfluous to basic minimal needs. That there's a kind of an indulgence in having stuff. And I think Hart and Negri are here suggesting that, at least from their point of view, the multitude is something that would definitely have stuff, that there's an abundance here. Human productivity can create all kinds of wonderful things. I have friends who shall remain nameless in case they're watching it. But I definitely have some friends who come from that perspective that I'm talking about, and they would be very cynical about, having an Apple iPad, because they would go like, well, oh my God, it's the only reason you want that is because of marketing, and marketing has made you an idiot, it's lobotomized you. And I don't know that Hart and Negri believe that marketing is all that bad. I think they're aware that it has negative potential, but I think they're also aware that marketing is effective labor, as we're going to talk about that in a minute. You know, that it comes from genuine and authentic sort of awareness it comes from awareness of genuine and authentic human needs and human desires. And desire itself is not a bad thing, right? So wanting an Apple iPad is not a bad thing for sure. In a perfect society, we would all have Apple iPads, right? Whereas from a sort of a more Christian perspective, that probably wouldn't be the case, you know. So if there's a socialism in Christianity, and many people argue there is, it's a socialism of poverty. I think it's a socialism of renunciation of wealth and goods and services and luxuries. But I think for Hart and Negri, that's not true at all. This is a socialism of riches for all, in to the extent that it's possible, in an environmentally sustainable manner. And so that's something we can maybe talk about another time. But back to our arguments about the assigned reading. Who is in this project? Who is in the multitude? Well, I was struck by one line that emerged here on page 106, where they say that no political priority can be seen among the forms of labor. All forms of labor are today socially productive, and that's worth pausing to think about, because one of the things we've been saying, of course, is that throughout the late 60s and 70s, all these different struggles emerged: the struggle of the housewife, the struggle of the colonial subject, the struggle of the racial minority figure, the civil rights struggles all sort of came to the fore. And they weren't just the struggles of the traditionally conceived Marxist agenda, the proletariat versus the capitalist. These were other struggles. But what unifies these struggles, of course, here is the fact that each one of these entities, whether it's the poor or the housewife or what have you, all of these forms of struggle indicate forms of labor, and all of these forms of labor are today socially productive. And that's where we're going to be going with this, is to try partially, our job is to explain why Hart and Negri think all these various struggles are productive, where this claim is coming from, and we will move on to that in due time here in this lecture. First of all, let's talk about one very important term here in explaining why these struggles are linked today, and that is the idea of a tendency. And of course, we'll summarize this later, and they summarize it at the end of 2.1 by referring to Marx's Grundrisse text. And the Grundrisse means the notebooks, by the way. And so Marx's notebooks were sort of literally his sort of rudimentary notes that he had sketched out for future books, for future research, for future publishing. But enough about that. The term that they like from Marx is the idea of a tendency. They are interested in the fact that even in Marx's time, the working class was not the only form of labor that was around, but it was rapidly becoming a dominant form of labor, not in a quantitative sense, but rather, as they say, in a qualitative sense. What does that mean? It means that even though the industrial form of labor that Marx was looking at, which was preeminent in the workshops in Manchester, in the manufactories in Manchester in England, he and Engels went to study these, and they found that basically there were kind of initial forms of what we now later call the assembly line coming into place, and they were interested in the working habits and the relationship between living time and working time for these newly proletarian workers. Of course, not everywhere in England was proletarianized in that sense, but nevertheless, as time was passing, the form of labor, the practices of labor of the proletarian worker were starting to shape the rhythms and habits of the other workers in different sectors. And so one of the things that Hart and Negri are going to try to do in this chapter is show that while today the working class is not the hegemonic form of labor anymore, we have a new type of immaterial labor emerging, but that it is also hegemonic as a tendency, and in exactly the same way that Marx was talking about vis-a-vis the working class. And so they're going to trace down the hegemonic tendencies of this new subject of labor, the immaterial laborer, and they're going to trace that down in two ways. They're going to talk about the fact that there's intellectual work being done and affective work being done. Now, what the hell does affect mean? We're going to talk about that in just a second. But just to sort of say it for now, that most types of labor today involve both of these elements. They involve intellectual work and affective work. So intellectual work, of course, is working with symbols, working with data, working perhaps with computers. And so it's very easy to see how information technology is a hegemonic tendency within labor today, and how workers need to be able to be sort of clever, if you can permit me to use that word, where maybe the more material traditional industrial worker was perhaps not as required to be intellectually engaged. After all, what he was doing was putting rivets on a Model T Ford car. What the new type of post-Fordist worker is doing is much more intellectual in many ways. He has to know how to operate complicated machines, and not just in the industrial assembly line, but in everything that we do. We are much more IT centric. We're much more able in terms of our data manipulation capacities and things like that. So there's clearly a difference there on that hand. But also this notion of affect. What is affect? Well, if you're not familiar with the term, the point would be that affect is working with feelings, working with the ability to make human relationships. Affect has a sort of a history as a concept that goes back to the Greeks, but generally it's this idea that say working in a nursing home, or working, I've sometimes used the example in class of talking about the sex chat phone worker, who, the live sex chat phone worker, and how that sex chat phone worker has to be able to produce a feeling in the person calling. The person calling obviously is spending money because the person wants to feel a certain something, and the person on the other end of the phone has to provide that feeling or help create that feeling. Of course, who's the person making the feeling? It's the consumer, right? So the consumer is actually producing his own feeling, which is weird because it blurs the line between production and consumption. But the phone worker, the chat line phone worker, is there to try to help that production take place, to assist it, to help the person make believe that what's going on is going on. And so what kind of skills and capacities are required to engage in effective labor? Usually they're the ability to act in a certain way, right? Most actors, of course, in plays and dramas are reading from a script, but we have a popular thing these days called freeform acting, where actors will sort of be given a line or two or a theme, and they'll have to talk about that theme for a period of time. We have game shows based on this and such. And I think the sex chat phone line worker is very similar to this type of person in general. Now, Hart and Negri give the example of journalism, and I think that's very interesting, right? Because actually, the more and more we look at our television stations, this is Jon Stewart's great complaint about CNN, that it's not really a news station, that it's an entertainment station. And of course, we'd say, well, yeah, sure, like duh. Hart and Negri would say duh, that any kind of journalism today, by virtue of the fact that television stations have to sell revenue, have to sell advertising in order to make revenue, they're going to have to keep people passionate about their station, and the way they do that is creating feelings in the viewers. And so television stations increasingly are turning to theatrical techniques in order to sustain that interest on their viewing audience, or from their viewing audience. What does it mean to say that immaterial labor is hegemonic? Is this to say that everybody's becoming a computer worker, that everyone's becoming someone capable of working with emotions? Yes and no. I mean, yes, insofar as IT work and work in terms of feelings or non-linear types of work. When we say non-linear, we're talking about this ability to remember to sort of anticipate what the person on the other end of the phone wants, what kind of relationship they're trying to consume, and help them build that. So that idea of being able to work with someone and producing a feeling within them while not reading from a script or reading only from the most provisional script. If anyone's worked in a call center, they know exactly what I mean. You have very loose scripts, and you have to work within the confines of those scripts to an extent, but you're usually given some free rein, and that's where your creative capacities, your ability as an artist, if you will, to think on your feet, to think at the spur of the moment, that's where that comes in, and that's where that matters. So one thing Hart and Negri say is that it's important to recognize that immaterial labor is in fact material, that it's not just sort of thin air stuff, that it involves real bodies and real feelings and real emotions, and that just don't be too confused by the fact that sometimes it just looks like bits and bytes on the internet or over a phone line, that there's actually real people involved. So if the emerging form or tendency in labor is what we call immaterial or biopolitical labor, then what are the consequences? And there's several consequences they identify, and I'll go through most of them, but not all. First of all, they say that the social spheres are blurring as a result of this, because remember what I said a moment ago, all the different struggles, even struggles that didn't necessarily look, once upon a time, that would not necessarily have looked like they had anything to do with capitalism. Say the struggle of African Americans for racial equality and justice in America. It might not have looked once upon a time that was necessarily a struggle to do with capitalism, but Hart and Negri are suggesting that today, increasingly because of the dominant hegemony of biopolitical labor, that the form of life itself, that life itself, is increasingly involved in making value, right? So if and we're going to get into this in a second, right? But I mean, their major contention is that work used to happen in the factory, right? I mean, that's what Marx was focused on. But today, obviously, this is just not true, that the social spheres are blurring. It's not easy to tell anymore which sphere is involved in, which sphere of life is involved in the production of value, because they all seem to be involved to some extent. Certainly the factory is still there working away, but now it seems that even the unemployed are somehow involved in production of value. Why? Because, and I mean, I've used this example before and I'll use it again here. What makes a pair of Nike running shoes valuable, I guess, would be a good question to sort of demonstrate this. What makes Nike running shoes valuable is the fact that everybody who wants one is participating in a form of labor that, whether they know it or not, is doing a type of mental work, right? They're doing a mental activity by investing their passions into this Nike swoosh symbol and saying, in their minds, repeating to themselves, this is a really cool symbol and I really want these running shoes because they have that symbol. So that form of activity, which Hart and Negri say is actually a type of productive labor, is going on all throughout society. And so this is what they mean when they say that value is no longer just made in the factory. Because back in Marx's time, brands weren't really that important. Today the brand is everything. And so if the brand is everything, how does that work? I mean, the brand doesn't add value, or the value, that the brand adds is not added in the factory, right? The value that the brand adds is added in society, that is outside the factory, and that's very, very important. So that's one initial reason why you might think that it matters to talk about immaterial labor, because immaterial labor is going on everywhere today, and it's what makes cigarettes popular, it's what makes Nike running shoes popular, or any other. It's what makes Britney Spears popular, right? It's the fact that we all think she's very sexy and want to be friends with her on Twitter. Okay, so there you go. Now, Hart and Negri also say that that the immaterial labor is also changing, because just as in Marx's time, industrial labor was changing the way other types of labor were done, so too in our time, immaterial labor is changing the way other types of labor are done, that are outside of the immediate sort of proper sphere of immaterial work. Agriculture, for example, is being inflected by it. Women's work is being inflected by it. And how do they make that point? Well, both agriculture and women's work, of course, traditionally based on what you might call open science, or handed down oral knowledge. There's ways of doing things. Animal husbandry, for example, you don't necessarily have to go to school to learn it. You can learn it through apprenticeship on a farm. If you were raised on a farm, or if you're working on a farm since a young age, you're part of that open science, that non-privatized science of farming. And they also have to know effect, and by that we mean they have to know skills of non-linear labor. They have to know how to anticipate things. Women's work is very much based on that, of course, because what do you think looking after babies involves? A whole lot of non-linear labor, right? You can't just read it from a textbook the whole time. You have to kind of use your judgment and have a feeling for what the baby's going through. Does it need food? Does it need to be cleaned? Does it need to go to bed? Oftentimes that is affect, right? That is affect. That is the type of labor that an effective worker is engaged in. So producing affect is not just about feelings. It's about non-linear capacities of work. That, in other words, an ability to anticipate what you are called on to do in this or that situation. And so if all these different spheres of life and all these different types of work are now sort of becoming affective and becoming intellectual, then these things have changed since Marx's time, then what does it mean to speak about alienation, right? Because in Marx's time, alienation was happening in the factory, and the deal was that the boss was trying to steal free hours of labor from the worker by getting the worker to sell him or herself short at the place where the worker was hired, because there were other workers that could do the job as well. And so in order to get the job, the worker had to compete the price of the labor downwards. Obviously that type of alienation, that happens in the factory is a genuine one. Once I've finished doing the work, I don't own what I've produced, and I have not got the full value of what I've produced from the capitalist. So that's classic sort of Marxist move there. But Hart and Negri say that in fact today it's sort of more profound in a way, alienation, because I'm selling something extremely intimate. That is my very thoughtful self, my ability to engage in non-linear labor, my passion, my care, my concern for the person I'm looking after in the nursing home, for example. This is my love, if you will, that is being expropriated from me, and so when production draws on love and passions and emotions, it's quite different to just simply being a laborer in a sort of an assembly line context. Also, another implication of this is that the conditions of work have changed, that I'm increasingly working in the shower, so to speak. They mentioned that in the text, and I thought I would mention it to you, that work is happening, the division between time at work and time at home is blurring. I may be pondering ideas in the shower because I have a presentation to make later in the day, and I'd like for it to be as good as possible. So, the ideas don't stop coming at 5 p.m. when it's time to go home. If indeed, when you go home at all, the ideas may still keep coming. And so that's one of the difficulties or risks with intellectual life is it's great, but you don't really know necessarily all the time where to draw the line. When do you take a time out? That's an important question. Um, another couple of consequences are to do with the fact that we're very mobile in this type of labor. Post-Fordist or immaterial labor requires tremendous mobility, and also it involves short-term contracts. So we can say that immaterial laborers are precarious, right? They don't have guarantee one minute to the next about their job security. But the big implication or the big consequence of the shift towards immaterial labor is this one: that the capitalist is not really involved anymore. You might say, well, think about it. Like the capitalist, used to be involved a lot in the process of making value, right? The capitalist would put up the factory and invite the workers into the factory, and would be central to the coordination of the raw physical power or physical work of the workers. And I think today this is really Harton-Negri's big point when it comes to thinking about biopolitical labor or immaterial labor, depending on what you want to call it. That productive cooperation, if workers are increasingly intellectual, and if workers are increasingly working alongside each other using these techniques of emotional labor, then that cooperation is emerging now very spontaneously from the workers. It's not the initiative, if you will, to work, to do this or that type of work. And I'm not saying the initiative to work in the sense of going to work. I'm saying the initiative to act in this way or that way, the decision to act in this way or that way, or the momentum to act in this way or that way at the point of value production is increasingly grounded in the spontaneity of the worker and the self leading nature of contemporary labor, self-organizing, self-governing, self-directing, if you want to use those words instead. So do we have a risk here of overblowing this novelty, this new development? Harton-Negri recognized that it might be difficult to sort of accept that this is all that new. I mean, after all, isn't it the case that every form of labor in human history has relied on what we call the common, or the capacities of the common, the language, the capacities of using language, the capacities of knowing what symbols we must use, our ways of expressing ourselves, or ways of talking that we only really know as human beings, that can, from a certain social background, that we can use, for example, in order to soothe someone who might be in pain. If I'm a teacher, I know, like hundreds of years ago, teachers were already talking to children and knew how to talk to children in ways that, would soothe their pain if they'd skinned their knee out in the playground, And so you might say, well, people were able to do that a long time ago. What's so new about this effective labor? Why are you making a big deal about effective labor? But the Harton-Negri wouldn't deny that. They say that every form of labor has relied on the common. Every form of labor in human history has relied on the common. But the difference now is that in circulating in capitalism today, it was the case that the majority of the products used to be commodities. Today, the majority of products are not necessarily commodities. They're brands, they're political messages, for example. They all seem to have this very, very social nature. And I think that's a critical point for Harton-Negri as they're trying to explain what is going on here.